Hello everybody, and welcome to our first system design tutorial. Here I'm going to be showing you the basic system design of a messaging system for object-oriented programming and gameplay. Or rather, I should say, game design / game programming. So let me lay out the basics of a very simple game. Here you have the basic game, which is represented by this box. The input, the player character, a bow, and a human. So, say you want your player character to fire the bow whenever you click left click. So, you'd obviously get some info from the input system, put it to the player character, and then take the player character's info and give it to the bow. And then the bow would fire. But the problem with this is that inside the player's character's procedures, you'd have to run an input procedure and then a bow procedure based off of it. And this clutters up your code and makes it a bit harder to, for example, make it so that a human, a random AI character in your world, can fire the bow. So, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of these three connections and create a messaging system, which I shall represent with this box and this little thing there. And so what the messaging system does is it decouples the call to the code from what is calling the code. So for example, the input would send a message to the player saying that left click has been clicked, rather than the player character having to ask the input system whether or not left click has been clicked. And then the player would send a message to the bow saying that the bow should fire at the player character's location, rather than the player character running the actual code from the bow to fire. And here we can have the human send a message to the bow to fire as well, and then the bow will fire for the player character and the human. The messaging system is going to be made up of two classes and a struct. That is a structure in C++, might be called something else in other games. Not other games, other languages. So here we have the message, and here we have the sender class, and here we have the listener class. Let me just label these. Sender and listener. And basically the sender will send a message to the listeners. So in the sender we'll have a little list of listeners, and in the listener we'll have a list of messages. And the sender knows which listeners are listening to it, so the sender isn't sending messages to like a random place in the code, and then the listeners have to go check on it. It's sending it straight to the listeners, and then the listeners will have a procedure which will tell whichever class, whichever object I should say, they're inside of, what has been sent to them, and then probably clear it afterwards, unless you want to log which messages it's receiving. And then the message can be really anything. You could put any data you want inside here. So you could have, like, say, I don't know, a string, maybe, as well as an integer and a vector. And all of that could be sent. Now, you could have different types of messages, different types of senders, and different types of listeners, so that each class is sending different types of messages around, so that you minimize the overhead for messages. Or you could have a single type of message with a bunch of information in it, and have it all set to null and 0, so that it doesn't take up that much space, and you don't have to write a whole bunch of different message types. And then only one sender and one listener, and the sender would just send the messages, and the listener would have different different procedures to read the messages, the different type of messages, depending on what the class wants from that listener. Or, yeah, or as I said, you could have a bunch of different types of messages. I think there's a balance to be struck there, where you can split the messages up into a couple different types, and the senders and listeners up into a couple different types, just so that you don't have a whole bunch of overhead for one message being sent, but also so that you don't have to write a whole shit ton of code for sending different messages. And that's going to be the totality of this tutorial, and I will see you in the programming side.